Hello everyone, how are you doing? Good. Right, I think we should start with a little bit of media and a little bit of nostalgia, shall we?
Know what this is? It's a man.
Of the 15 carload ship, transfer 12A units to Area 3 and 16
talking to a machine.
Charges to Area 4.
And this is a machine talking to a machine.
Hello, George. This is Chris over at Purchasing. Hi, Chris. What can I do for you? Well, I was wondering, on that order we just received, can we...
You know what this is? A man talking to another man. Man to man, man to machine, machine to machine. In a short time, we've come a long way. This brings you, whether you're a one-man company or a corporation executive, face to face with many challenges. Challenges of change that you may recognize.
Hey, Larry, they want to know where the merchandise is.
Look, I'm sorry. We're trying to get the stuff out as fast as we can, but we're up to our ears in orders.
Yeah. Well, I just came in a minute ago. Well, I know I hate to lose your business, but both Jack and I had to be out. We're busy as the devil. Just one of those things.
I don't understand it. We buy some new equipment, change some method, and it's 2 weeks before anybody finds out about it.
What's the matter with you guys back there anyway, huh? I work my pants to the bone trying to make sales, and I can't get the information I want when I need it.
I don't understand.
What's going on?
I don't understand.
I know, but how can I be in when I'm out?
I don't understand either. Like, where are all the women? It's not that long ago. So 1961, you know, man to machine, machine to machine. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, when you look back on some of that stuff? It's a version of the future that I suppose to give it some credit, we'll give it some credit. It's got some of the technology right, but it doesn't get any of the social, cultural stuff right at all. And I'd argue, and I will argue, that that is more important, or certainly as important as the technology. It's interesting when you look back at science fiction writers, as I'm sure we all do, to look at who got the predictions about the future right. It's actually people like Philip K. Dick, who were much more interested in communications, media, ecology, comms, all that kind of stuff, very cultural things. He got the future much more right than people like Heinlein or Asimov, or even Arthur C. Clarke, who were much more interested and much more technology-led and military-led. So culture is just as important as the technological future. But one of the questions I wanted to pose was, who decides the future? I think we know who was perhaps sitting in the room while they decided that was going to be the future in 1961 at AT&T. Probably not that many women. But this is an obvious example, I always think, of the jetpack. Who would like a jetpack? Oh, okay. Well, you see, the thing is... Okay. The thing is, there aren't that many women I come across who envision a tech-enabled future that features a jetpack. I mean, yeah, some do, obviously, but in fact, there are lots of future tech concepts, I think, that are devoid of any sort of point of view or any female influence. Obviously, it's not as bad as it used to be in the past, but it's still there. And I love this quote from Sarah Kemba at the University of London. You've got smart bras and vibrating pants and talking kitchen workshops and augmented reality bathroom mirrors that read tags on your clothing that tell you what not to wear. And there's no reflection, really, on any of this at all. Like, is it really real? Is it really required? Is it really needed? And I think that is the unfortunate conclusion in the second quote on this slide, which is, you know, when you lose out on women's voices, you lose out on the issues that they have to deal with. And so a lot of the time you end up, one could end up, producing or making products or services that, you know, don't solve the right kinds of problems and certainly don't solve the right kinds of problems for everyone. So let's just have a look at some of the products and services that there have been in the past, I think, that might make this point. Personal assistance, I think this is a really interesting area, and even in the last few years, things have evolved, but I'm using this example, which was from a few years ago now, of Microsoft Cortana. I think, we can debate this after, but I think there's a certain amount of bias coded within this, this personification of a digital personal assistant, a bias that probably exists in the analog world, that it's all too easy in an unconscious way to sort of transfer into the digital world. So here we are. So Cortana, I think, came out of Halo, and at the time when it was launched, there was a poster which said, "Meet Cortana. She not only learns and remembers what you like, she can also provide reminders based on your location and contacts. All you have to do is ask." There's nothing wrong with that, I'm sure you might think. And there isn't in lots of ways, but why does this digital assistant have to be presented so feminine? I think the answer to that is really bound up in the way we think about the type of job that it might be replacing. So in actual fact, you know, the fact that you provide reminders based on your location and contacts, it's kind of a clerical job, right? It's an administrative clerical job. And as a society, we might have some assumptions about who does that kind of clerical job. And I think what you're seeing here is the assumption that basically this is mostly a woman's job. It's mostly that of the secretary, and that is a persona, a role that it has in the past very much been seen as a female role. And in fact, when Microsoft were researching Cortana, as it became known, they did actually interview and research with lots of human PAs. So it's not surprising, is it, that what got transferred into the digital assistant was quite a lot of stuff, we might call it bias, that existed in the real world amongst PAs. So you end up with something that is inevitably, in this case, quite gendered. And I think what goes beyond this idea that a clerical work is a woman's work, mostly, is the idea that the whole of really the service sector, certainly as it was viewed at the time and existed at the time, is largely a female domain. There's a lady called Helen Hester who I would urge you, if you're interested in this kind of thing, urge you to look up. She works at the University of West London now. Lots of videos online. And lots of talks and lots of papers on this, but she sums it up quite nicely when she says, digital assistants are usually advertised with female voices. They're often referred to as she in consumer reviews, technology blogs and marketing materials. Such gender markers further emphasize the association with so-called feminized labor or clerical and service work. So, of course, we all know that Google doesn't do this. It isn't gendered. Google now isn't gendered, and so much the better for it. So why would a company want to create a product or a service that is quite gendered and that I would argue does have some assumptions and bias programmed into it? Well, I guess the answer to that is because they want to form the biggest, strongest emotional connection that they possibly can with the technology, and often there's a belief that it's easier to do that if you can kind of humanize or anthropomorphize technology in this way. And all of the research that we've done at the Future Laboratory would tend to go along with that, certainly at the moment, and suggest that, you know, technology that is anthropomorphized, that feels human, that feels emotional, we find it easier to develop as humans an emotional connection with. There's lots of interesting studies out there. Go and check some of them out. But this was one in Japan in 2015. It was a study that proved that we have empathy for a robot in pain. And one of the interesting things about this whole area is that the more we tend to humanize chatbots and virtual assistants and machines, the more we do this, the more, in turn, we display human emotions towards them, even though they're not human at all. It's kind of a psychological trick, isn't it? So it's no surprise then, is it? Because when you look at it on the face of it, this is a mad statistic. 26% of people aged 18 to 34 in the UK said they would happily date a humanoid robot. Well, please tell me you're surprised at that. But when you see it in the context of the way in which we're presenting, or the way in which some companies present some of the technology like this to consumers, perhaps it's not that surprising. And I know that Jeff Bezos has been quoted as saying that Alexa, for example, has received over 250,000 marriage proposals. So now I'm not surprised about those sorts of things you see anymore. So it's interesting, but how is this being missed? Because I don't think there's that much debate or discussion about this, although there is much more of a discussion and debate brewing about AI and ethics in general. Bias and stereotyping are the assumptions that lie behind some of the diversity that is or isn't there in our technology. I don't think people have been discussing it that much in the mainstream. And you might say, well, it's harmless enough, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with wanting to create an emotional connection with technology. Of course there isn't. But whilst we're thinking about that, let me just show you this.
ねえ、起きてってば。おはよう。
おはよう。
あ、今日雨が降るかもしれないから傘持って行って。急がないと遅刻しちゃうよ。
行ってきます。
行ってらっしゃい。気をつけてね。商品もらえなくて。 おかえりなさい。
So there's that. I mean, that exists, obviously, in Japan. That exists, but I can't remember her name now. Is it Haliki? I can't remember her age. Obviously, she's AI hologram. But so, unless the translation is way off, I mean, I think that is quite worrying in that there is obviously potential for automated systems, for AI, all this sort of stuff, to be programmed consciously or unconsciously with sort of girlish avatar behavior or sort of feminized, disembodied voices. And I actually would call Alexa out for being the latter. So the question is, how is it being missed? And also, does it help or hinder diversity in our technologically connected world that we now live in? So one of the things I think hasn't helped the conversation to get started or the discussion to really happen is perhaps the way in which we think about artificial intelligence and specifically the way we interpret and think about the idea intelligence. So has everybody read Superintelligence? Yeah? No? Okay. So we tend to think of intelligence as cognition. It's the intellect, it's the thought process, it's the stuff up here that doesn't require any embodiment by the physical body and doesn't have any sort of contact with the social world either. So we tend to understand intelligence in quite a removed, aloof way, and that's why we think, you know, artificial intelligence is just all about cognition. Well, I would dispute that, and I think the best person to turn to on this and for clues about how we could start to think about this a bit better in a cultural and social sense is Professor Alan Winfield, who's Professor of Robot Ethics at Bristol. And I've listened to a lot of what he's got to say, and I've seen him on panel discussions and been interviewed, and I've read his papers. And he's very interesting on the definition of intelligence, because obviously he works in the area of robotics. And he says that when you think about intelligence, intelligence is fundamentally about deciding what to do next. It's action selection, which I think is right. But that's why artificial intelligence is, if it's replacing anything, it's kind of replacing perhaps the decisions that we have tended to make. Now, he says that if you can choose the right action, then arguably you're intelligent. But one thing's for sure, intelligence is not one thing. Intelligence is actually an emergent property of three things. The physical robot, in this case, when he talks about robotics, its own intelligence, the data, and then the environment that it finds itself in. And I'm sure you've talked a lot this morning, or it's been picked up on, that context is very important in terms of making something intelligence. It's that learning mechanism. So I would argue that actually we need to think much more about culture than cognition when we think, or at least as much, when we think about artificial intelligence. And if you go on to read a few more of his papers, you can understand what he's saying about this, because he's done lots of experiments with robots, and one I've just got on a slide here to talk to you about, which is the emergence of artificial culture in robot societies. So he's done these experiments that have demonstrated that when you get a group of robots together, a swarm of robots as he calls them, they can actually create their own culture. So his explanation is that the robots have the ability to imitate each other, as we would, and because they're real robots, they've imitated imperfectly, which gives rise to new behaviours, to innovation, if you like. And he says, so under the right circumstances, with the right dynamics, completely new behaviour takes over. It's like fashion or culture. So he's talking about the emergence of culture amongst robots, and we might argue that that's very different from culture that could emerge from humans, but we don't know that, do we? And so maybe one day there will be an emergent culture from robots and humans together. Anyway, little sidebar. I think it's important because if we can think about artificial intelligence and intelligence, not just as cognition, but as culture as well, we're starting to think about the effects and the inputs and the outputs of technology and how we want ourselves to behave and how we want technology to behave as part of that culture. So if artificial intelligence can make culture, we should be asking ourselves, shouldn't we? How do we ensure that it can be as diverse and rich as possible, rather than narrow and stereotypical? Because I think the film that I showed you at the beginning was to try and demonstrate just how narrow and stereotypical we could have a view of a future technical world, and actually conversely, how diverse and rich and interesting we really want it to be, just like the real world. So I'd argue for a shift for more culture than cognition, and for us to start using the language not of superintelligence, but of social intelligence, to remind us just how important culture is in this equation. So, what can we do about this? Well, I think there are three markers, or just examples, I guess, of things that are already going on. There's a lot more than this, and we can talk about those. But three markers or examples of where we need to be more cognizant about social intelligence, not just superintelligence, in technology. So the first one I've called out, I've talked a lot today about gender, but of course diversity is not just about gender, it's about race, religion, social class, whatever. We want to be as inclusive as possible, I would argue. And that's what Code 2040 tries to do in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. Has anybody heard of these guys or used them? No? So if you want to know a bit more about them, there's a brilliant podcast with the founder called Laura Weidman-Powers, who set this up a few years ago. It's a podcast on Recode, Cara Risha does, and she interviews her, and she'll talk to you all about, she talked to her about how this got set up. But frankly, the point of it is that 2040 is a year in future history. 2040 is the decade in which the US population is going to be more than 50% non-white. So that's quite a big shift in demographics, and it's quite a big cultural shift. And what she's trying to do is work with companies, tech companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, to try and provide the tools, the tactics and the training to help these companies invest in people of color, Black, Latino, whatever, and try and create more opportunities and bring them into the workforce. Because she sees this as a big, important demographic shift that perhaps not everybody is well equipped to make. I think she made a good point in that radio interview, or that podcast actually, because she said that diversity has been a compliance issue for HR in the past. But actually, the world is changing and the workforce is changing demographically and really quite radically. And so actually, this is about change for growth, if it's anything. And obviously, her point is the more diversity you can have in the workforce, the more growth you are going to achieve as an output. A good ambition to have, I would say. So the second thing is, the first thing was inclusive inputs, thinking about what's going in, because that affects what comes out. The second thing is diversity of perspectives. I wanted to pick up on this because diverse teams are better at problem solving, and it's been proven time and time again. But also diverse spaces are more inventive and creative. And cultural diversity can actually, and does often, lead to much better economic performance, and there are plenty of studies on that as well. Just on the first point, really, teams. When you get very diverse teams, and there's lots of research, as I said, showing that they come out with, they're better at problem solving, basically. They're more creative and innovative in terms of problem solving. But I don't know if you know the reason for that, because the reason is that when there is a more diverse group and there's more variety in it, there's less of a sense of accepted wisdom, if you like. And so what the group spend most of their time doing is learning. They spend a lot more time learning, explaining, demonstrating, articulating, listening, than a group that's very like-minded would, because they already think they know the accepted wisdom. And so when more explaining and learning happens, it leads to a better outcome, a better conclusion, because there's been much better understanding and probably a probing of many more possibilities than there would have been in quite a like-minded group. And so a group, in a way, or a team, is a bit like a city. Cities are probably one of the most ancient technologies we've got, but it is also one of the most innovative technologies. It's diverse. Great cities, successful cities, are innovative because of the diversity. And it's the combination in a city of the different elements, different beliefs, different experiences, different values, different ways of living, different rituals, different foods, all that sort of stuff. All of that is in very, very close proximity as being pushed together to create new combinations. So it is no accident that cities are innovation hubs, that they are the most creative places. That's what happens. And so I think we should think about our teams as mini cities, if you like, because we know it works and it creates a better outcome. And finally, just on a personal note, I'd say about that I did some research for quite a big media company not long ago into Gen Z. We did a lot of research talking, ethnographic research, talking to sort of 20-year-olds and slightly younger about their media habits and social media discovery and content and conversation, all that sort of stuff. And in the course of this, we started to explore diversity. And one of the things that became really clear was that they don't, you won't be surprised at this, I'm sure, they don't see diversity in terms of demographics. The diversity then is not about gender or race or where you're born or nationality or any of those things. To paraphrase, they said, diversity is a variety of life experiences. And what they really wanted to see in diverse programming and in media, actually, was they wanted to learn from others who'd had different experiences, who'd taken different paths in life. And I think that is very much a big cultural shift. It's a different understanding and exploration of diversity. And actually, if we take that kind of path, again, will lead to better outcomes in our media and comms, I think. So this idea of learning from difference is actually the clue to unlocking how AI and some of those sorts of technologies can improve diversity in culture. Now, I know Alphabet, for example, have their own great examples of this. I'm not sure if you touched on it this morning. I know Jigsaw has launched a project to defeat online harassment, I guess, using machine learning by identifying what words or phrases might have a certain toxicity. So what might be abusive or what might be insulting or offensive. And if you can identify some of those words or phrases in media, then obviously you can take whatever action you've agreed with the publisher about that, whether you remove it or you report it or whatever. So there are ways in which machine learning and AI can be used to, allow diversity of opinion. But this is the example I think is probably the best example at the moment, and I love this app. This is an app which promotes gender equality actually using AI. Has anybody used it or seen it before? No? Okay, so it's called Gender EQ, and it's made by the guys at Doberman. And it uses machine learning and speech recognition to create an app that helps track gender equality in the meeting room. So we're back to gender equality, but you can see how this could be, you could see how this could be taken on and progressed to all kinds of other, my time's up, all kinds of other levels. But at the moment, what it does is you put this on the table in a meeting room, for example, and it tracks the male voices and the female voices. And you can see there's a little line in the middle, and it shifts over to show you where the conversation and who the conversation is being dominated by. So it's as close as you can get at the moment to a real-time visualization of speaker contribution in a meeting. But I think what's even more interesting than that is that even the presence of it in a meeting room changes people's behavior, actually, and it helps them be a bit more conscious about who's speaking and how many people are speaking, and is everybody getting their fair share of opinion. But one of the reasons I wanted to use this as an example is because I think it's probably safe to say that had this app existed in 1961, when AT&T were thinking about their vision of the future, and they were sitting in a meeting room thinking, well, what kind of film should we make about the communications technology in the future? Supposing that there had been any women in the room, and this app had been in the room, I don't think they would have ended up with the film that I opened this presentation with. So, I think, in conclusion, the key point that I wanted to make, really, was that it's diversity in technology that's going to drive the advancement in trust. I really believe that. I really think that the more technology can encompass, embrace, and even influence and bring about diversity, the more it will be trusted. And so I guess the concluding message is that diversity is not a problem, it's a solution. It's the key to unlocking the trust in the tech of tomorrow. Thank you.
Wow, Tracey, thank you so much. What a way to bring us to a close. So many ideas in there, so many insights. I know, my brain is definitely spinning. I hope in a good way, obviously. I hope everyone else is too. We've had lots of questions coming in. Perhaps we can have a look at them on the screen. One from Geraldine, first of all, to say, do you think the UK is behind the US and other countries in embracing diversity in tech? And what can we do to step up as brands?
Oh, gosh.
Small question.
I wish I knew the answer to that. I'd make a fortune. I don't think the UK is particularly behind, actually. And I think particularly in academia, and the academics that are working closely with technology companies, they are really bringing this debate to the table now. I mean, there were a few panel discussions and conferences last week. There are big ethical dilemmas over technology, and I think actually, if anybody is prompting and probing that, it's the UK. What can we do to step up as brands? I think that point about thinking about what goes in, because you are what you eat, what goes in is the outcome you get, right? So not just thinking about what outcome you want as a brand, whether it's however you connect with consumers or whatever associations you're making or what you think your brand purpose is, what are the ingredients that are going in? What's the team made up of? Who are they? What backgrounds do they come from? What kind of life experiences? And try and unpack some of the assumptions and biases that might sit within a team or a project or whatever it is. I think we've got to be quite brave and challenging of ourselves to do that.
So here's a question that follows neatly on from there, but you've almost answered there. In terms of delivering business value, isn't it more important to have people who think differently rather than people who look differently?
Totally. Absolutely. But then the question about that is, who is choosing the people who think differently? Because then you're into that spiral of, you've got to have people who think differently to enable them to choose other people who think differently. So I know people go through unconscious bias training and things like that, but I think there's much more to it. You don't want to just get back to your office and then you look around you and think, well, I did all this unconscious bias training, it was absolutely fantastic. And then look around and everybody's the same, or everybody's got the same view again. I think brands and companies have got to get much better at being challenged, rather than sort of rewarding the status quo and the groupthink.
Interesting one here as well, again from an anonymous questioner. Will AI be able to mitigate the impact of unconscious bias in recruiting so that Mohammed can have the same opportunities as Adam?
Well, there have been some experiments on that, haven't there? Sort of blind CVs and that sort of thing. And my understanding of some of those experiments and some of that research is that it has mitigated the impact of unconscious bias. Maybe not 100%, but my understanding is that those technologies, when they've been applied like that, have given much more opportunities to Mohammeds than Adams and Janes.
For example. And a question from Evelyn, perhaps. Should technology reflect culture or shape culture? Should people be able to choose who they interact with, what they interact with? For example, choosing male or female voices on my sat-nav or even on my Google Assistant?
Yeah. Well, I thought about this when I was writing the deck because I thought, oh, you might accuse me of wanting to get into social engineering. Which
Anyone want to get into that? We can.
Let's not. It's like all things in life, it's a balance, isn't it? I think to some extent you've got to create some familiarity. Other people can't connect with it and understand it, but it can't be so much familiarity that you just, as I said, just enforcing stereotypes all the time. I do think, the media industries, the advertising industries, communication industries have a responsibility to move the peanut forward and try and, in some sense, influence what's going on in society. Not to the extent of social engineering, but I think we can help some of these situations rather than hinder them.
Well, certainly in terms of not reinforcing stereotypes,
Exactly.
The advertising industry obviously has a very critical role to play. Well, thank you so much, Tracey. What an amazing way to end. Everyone, a round of applause for Tracey Follows.